Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to comment on some of the lessons learned that have been described by the panel, all of which are very helpful, some of which, especially Ambassador Jeffrey, you talked about our failure to react in a timely fashion. But I also want to talk about some of those things that we have done in the past that have precipitated some of the problems that we see today, and perhaps looking forward, some of the actions that we can take that could potentially prevent them, that may not be military in nature. And I really appreciate my colleague, Mr. Jones, pointing out that 2003, the invasion of Iraq, set off a chain of consequences, some of them factoring into what we're talking about today. And then the decision to remove Muammar Gaddafi in Libya had some very negative consequences, which we are still dealing with today. There was an interesting article, in addition to the one that Mr. Jenkins contributed to in The Atlantic, published in the New York Times, written by Scott Anderson, How the Arab World Came Apart. And one of the things that he notes is that in these areas where we are concerned about ISIS, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Libya, they all had something in common, which is that 100 years ago, they were creations of the West. They weren't inherently, there was no real Syria, there was no real Libya, there was no real Iraq. And these artificial political constructions could really only be kept together by a strong man. And typically the West would put a strong man of the minority, tribe, or sect in power. And it has produced some of the problems that we see today. This lack of coherence, this lack of national identity, this problem that despite the fact that we spent $60 billion training and equipping the Iraqi army, there was no real Iraqi army, and they melted in the face of a far more insignificant force in ISIS. And so my question is, to expand on the excellent question from the chairman, let's look 15 years back, let's look 15 years forward. Could you look 100 years back and 100 years forward with me? Is there something we could do to facilitate a different political construction in these three countries? The shorthand term for this is partition, but that acknowledges that these are not real countries the way that we think of countries, and acknowledges the sectarian interests, the tribal interests, the familial interests that trump national identity. It may be the least bad option of a number of bad options before us. Convince me why it's not worth exploring and pursuing.
And I think the reality is, as I mentioned in my testimony, that the partitions that we currently see in Syria and Iraq are going to persist. I know diplomats have to be optimists, and for a variety of reasons, we have to remain committed, at least in theory, to the territorial integrity of Syria and Iraq. The reality on the ground is quite different. Without abandoning the notion that we are in the business of being the new Sykes-Picot people who will now draw new lines in the sand, I do think that it might alter our approach to recognize that reality, and instead of thinking in terms of broad peace agreements that will encompass the entire nation, or governments that will be created that will be able to command the loyalty of all citizens within those territories, that we accept the reality and perhaps go for more modest local accommodations. That is, instead of one grand peace treaty, a series of small steps that are aimed only at lowering the level of violence and allowing some commerce to take place and life to come back to something approaching normality, as opposed to going for these three-point diplomatic shots that we sometimes try for.
If I could very quickly, Congressman, I agree with everything Mr. Jenkins said, but there are two problems with this that I think we need to consider. First of all, other than East Asia, I know of no part of the world where you've got countries with each its own ethnic, religious group, by and large, and a little bit Europe. What you described in the Middle East is absolutely correct, but sub-Saharan Africa saw the same thing without the same level of huge turmoil and generator of terrorism that we see in the Middle East. And in Latin America, again, that was basically one big Spanish set of colonies that then broke apart with very similar ethnic and religious backgrounds, but managed to survive as a set of independent countries. So that's the first thing. It may be that there's a special problem in the Middle East that we don't see elsewhere, and fixing borders won't fix that special problem. The second thing is, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, supporting the international order, national sovereignty, national unity should be our default position because it's what we represent. We can make exceptions to that, as Mr. Jenkins said, and as I was involved in the Balkans, where we helped break up countries. But one requirement that worked in the Balkans and that hasn't worked in the Middle East is if you're going to do any fiddling inside a country, everybody in that region has to be with you. Because if only one is against you, Syria and Iran with Iraq, Pakistan with Afghanistan, we know all too well in this room what happens. Thank you.